Now let's discuss the situation where you are in position against a flop continuation bet and a turn continuation bet. So here let's discuss where under the gun plus one raises, button calls, flop comes 9-7-5, under the gun plus one bets 33% pot on the flop, which they're going to do with mostly their best made hands. But if you think back to that strategy, it was really, really mixed because they're out of position. We call the flop. We make it to the turn. Because the player under the gun plus one bet in this scenario using a roughly polarized range, our equity is never going to be great going to the turn. And as you see, there really aren't a ton of great turns for us. I mean, an 8 and a 6 make it close to 50-50, but that's not even amazing. So this is a spot where when we're facing a bet on the turn, we're not really going to do a ton of raising in general. So let's say the turn is a 2 of hearts, so a complete blank for the most part. As you see, 2 of hearts is, like an okay card, but not great. And now the opponent bets giant. They do this 120% pot bet on the turn, which is a strong play with a very likely polarized range. Okay? Let's go through and categorize all of our hands. In this scenario, pretty much all pairs, I think, are reasonable enough besides under pairs. Notice I have 8s and 6s here categorized as folds. I think that's probably okay. Although, that said, they should probably stick around. This is probably a bit of an oversight. Yeah, I don't love it. I'd probably call with 8s. You have to understand, though, when the opponent is blasting it, what is the opponent essentially saying they have? They're saying they have over pairs, sets, 2 pairs, and good draws. And the thing is when you have 8s and 6s, you block the draws, don't you? So when you're blocking the draws, it makes it more likely they have a made hand. So you know what? I actually think I do like folding 8s and 6s. 4s and 3s are clearly folds. When you have a hand like 6-5 or 5-4 suited, I think it's probably okay to call because those have just a few more outs. I think everything else here looks reasonable. I have ace-queen suited as a call. This should probably be folded too. I don't love it, but it's nice to be able to stick around with some ace-high type hands just to give you better board coverage going to the river. Because if you fold out all of your aces here, you just have like no aces going to the river. Or almost no aces. Ace-4 and ace-3, these are hands that can probably call or fold. Should probably mix it up, really. Everything else I think looks reasonable. You may say, why not raise with your overpairs and your top pairs? Because if your opponent actually is polarized and they're blasting it with sets and overpairs, you don't really want to raise with jacks because it's actually not in great shape. Remember, when the opponent bets big on the turn using what is almost certainly a polarized strategy, and I know the GTO solver uses a polarized strategy, you in turn do not get to raise all that often, and also because you're in position, you should not raise all that often. And you may start to see patterns here, that whenever the turn is essentially a blank, very often the flop better will continue betting the turn using a somewhat big size. Because when the opponent calls the flop bet, very often they don't have their best made hands, right? Because they would have raised them on the flop. Like right here, notice that the player on the button here does not have 7s or 5s. And that's because they would have raised 7s or 5s on the flop. So given they don't have 7s or 5s, that makes their range a little bit weaker. Whereas under the gun plus one still has all the best hands in their range, right? And notice here, even slow playing hands like pocket 9s and 8-6, this is a scenario where I think we just need to call with everything and when we're facing an overbet. When we're facing a big bet on the turn, just call with everything. You don't need to raise with your nut hands. So I like this strategy. We are folding a lot, 56% of the time. This may be a little bit too much. I'm trying to think what else could I reasonably call here. I guess 8s and 6s. Maybe we could call like more ace-4 and ace-3. Not in love with calling with ace-8, but maybe ace-8 wants to call. I'm sure I probably just threw ace-queen in here as sort of like a consolation, to try to call a little bit more often. Let's see what solver does. I was folding 56%. Solver folds 52%. So solver does call a little bit more often than I do. And notice it does basically mix across the board. It did use the same logic as me with 8s and 6s. Whenever you have 8s and 6s, yes, you have 6 outs, but you're almost certainly behind at the moment and you block the draws. There's this idea of like reverse blockers where you don't want to block the draws in your opponent's range. So whenever we're calling in this scenario, I actually don't really want to have an 8 or a 6 in my hand because when I have those hands in my range or cards in my range, it makes it harder for the opponent to have a draw. You may think that having that card gives me additional equity, which it does, but it doesn't really matter if your opponent's sitting there with a very, very premium hand. So we do see ace-queen calling some. Are any 7s folded? No. Are any 5s folded? 5-4s folded a little bit. Under pairs are, of course, folded. Notice sets, 2 pairs. Really, nothing's raised at this point. And that's because when your opponent uses an overbet, you don't raise. You do a whole lot of calling. At least, as much calling as you reasonably can. Now let's take a look at 9, 7, 5, 9. If you think back, the 9 is, again, not a great card. We see the 9 as sort of, middle of the road. However, on the 9, we actually do have a decent amount of 9s, right? So when we have a decent amount of 9s, the opponent, when they do bet, even though they still have a bit of a range advantage here, they're usually going to bet using a small bet size. As you see, 33% pot. The opponent has to be betting using a smaller size because they're going to be running into some of our super nut hands on this turn. So again, go through, categorize your hands. Against a small bet size, you are going to want to raise some hands. So let's go through here and categorize our range. We have these 8s that look very clearly like draws. We have a whole bunch of pairs, right? All these are pairs. Then we have some various ace highs, and we should probably call some amount of them. Notice that when we're facing a small turn bet, we have to continue a lot. It's very, very important that when we're facing a small bet, we have to call a lot. And in this scenario, I know it feels pretty gross to call with like 3s and 4s and even like ace high, but it's probably the right play when you're in position. When you're in position, you should be calling pretty frequently. If like ace 10 very easily could be a call here. I think that's probably close. Notice in this scenario, we don't have any draws now with these hands, so they just have to fold, of course. And these overcards all fold too. So I think this looks nice and logical. As you see, we don't really get to have all that many bluffs here, just because we don't have very many super nut hands. We do have a few more nut hands here, like 10-9, 9-8, pocket 9s, 8-6, but we don't really need to raise all of them. It's very nice to protect our calling range, especially when some of our calling hands, like ace high, really want to just check it on the river, which, having some super nuts in your range, like 9s and 8-6, will disincentivize your opponent from just like blindly barreling you, right? So in here I'm folding 18% of the time. Solver folds a little bit more, 22%, but still a ton of calling. As you see, solver calls ace highs, at least some of them. Folds out ace 10, folds out some ace jack, so, sure. Calls basically every pair, raises some 9s. What bluffs does solver raise here? Solver does not raise with ace 8, interestingly enough. Solver doesn't have king 8. If it did, it would probably raise it. You see solver raises king 6 a lot of the time, so that makes sense. Solver raises jack 10 instead. Let's see, did I have jack 10? See, I didn't have jack 10 in my range because I would have played it differently on the flop, right? And this is where it's important to realize that when we're using a lot of mixed strategies like we are in this scenario, the solver is going to be playing slightly differently, and that's fine. It's fine to recognize that. We discussed this earlier. So I think this is just fine, reasonable strategy. We have to do a lot of calling. A big takeaway from this is when you're facing small bets, you do have to call very frequently. When you're facing bigger bets, you get to fold out way more often, even when you are in position. But again, go through, categorize your hands, and then proceed logically, like we've discussed thoroughly using the facing a bet response flowchart.